Book Summary, War, by Bob Woodward. Chapter 1. Beginnings and Strategy. As war opens, we're introduced to a President Obama who has just stepped into the White House, carrying the weight of two wars: Iraq, which is slowing down but still requiring attention, and Afghanistan, which is like a simmering pot about to boil over. Imagine stepping into a new job and immediately inheriting two giant projects that are each so complex that even the experts can't agree on how to handle them. That's the challenge Obama faces right out of the gate. He has the eyes of the nation on him, waiting for his strategy to win these wars and to finally bring the troops home. One of the first things Obama realizes is that there's no easy answer to the situation in Afghanistan. The previous administration had been deeply focused on Iraq, leaving Afghanistan to brew with more problems than solutions. Now, Obama finds himself in the middle of a war with unclear goals. What does victory even look like here? How does one know when to leave? To answer these questions, Obama organizes a strategy review, a serious deep dive into the mess of Afghanistan to figure out what's really going on and what they should do next. He gathers some of the most powerful and influential voices in the government and military, like Vice President Joe Biden, who's known for his straight talk, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, a seasoned figure with a balanced view of military issues, and the top military brass who have decades of experience on the battlefield. They all have their own opinions on how to handle this. Some see Afghanistan as a ticking time bomb that demands a heavy military presence to keep it under control, while others are wary of committing too many troops and want a lighter, more strategic approach. During these initial discussions, a clear divide becomes apparent. The military leaders, people like General Stanley McChrystal, who's commanding forces in Afghanistan, and General David Petraeus, famous for turning around the war in Iraq, are convinced that winning in Afghanistan requires more boots on the ground, more soldiers who can secure the towns and villages, win over local support, and root out insurgents. They believe in what's called a counter-insurgency strategy, or COIN for short. It's not just about fighting the enemy, it's about gaining the trust of the Afghan people and creating stability in the region. Obama, however, has his doubts. His gut feeling tells him that Afghanistan isn't Iraq, and a big surge of troops might not yield the same results here. He worries that a large military presence could create new problems and bog the US down in another long, unwinnable conflict. He's also very aware of the promises he made to the American people, promises about focusing on domestic issues and ending wars, not dragging them on. In the meantime, Biden offers a different perspective. Known for his blunt and sometimes controversial opinions, Biden suggests a counter-terrorism approach, which is less about holding territory and more about targeting key terrorist leaders. He sees Afghanistan not as a nation-building project, but as a battleground for combating terrorism, particularly Al-Qaeda. Biden argues that a leaner, smarter approach using drones, special forces, and intelligence could keep threats under control without the heavy costs of full-scale warfare. The discussions are intense, with Obama caught in the middle of a tug-of-war between different approaches. He wants to listen to the experts, but he also has his own vision and his own responsibilities to the American people. The debates often stretch for hours, with every voice offering a unique viewpoint shaped by years of experience, whether in combat zones, intelligence offices, or the halls of government. In these early days, Obama begins to grasp just how complicated the Afghan conflict truly is. It's not just about defeating the Taliban, it's also about the politics within Afghanistan, the fragile nature of its government, and the influence of neighboring countries like Pakistan. The stakes are high and there's no clear path to success. Obama faces a decision that will shape not only his presidency, but also the lives of thousands of American soldiers and countless Afghan civilians. To make things even trickier, Obama has a deadline in mind. He wants to set a time frame for the US commitment in Afghanistan, a signal to both the American people and Afghan leaders that the US won't be there forever. This idea of a timeline doesn't sit well with some of his military advisors, who fear it could embolden the Taliban and weaken the Afghan government's resolve. The military wants flexibility, not restrictions, to handle the situation as it unfolds on the ground. As Chapter 1 wraps up, we get a clear picture of the monumental task Obama faces. He is not only wrestling with a complex war, but also dealing with a highly charged debate among his top advisors. Everyone has strong, often conflicting opinions, and the stakes are as high as they can get. Obama must decide whether to go all in with a troop surge like in Iraq, or to follow a more restrained surgical approach focused on counter-terrorism. It's a moment of suspense as Obama weighs his options, knowing that whatever he chooses will have profound consequences. This decision is not just about military tactics, it's about defining what kind of leader he wants to be and how he wants America to engage with the world. Before we dive into the next chapter, please help our community by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Thanks. Chapter 2: Pressure and Military Advice. In Chapter 2, we dive into the intense back and forth between President Obama and his military advisors as they try to figure out the best way to handle Afghanistan. Picture this. Obama is a new president, still finding his footing, but he's already facing some of the toughest decisions a leader can make. On one hand, he has military leaders pushing hard for a surge of troops to stabilize Afghanistan. On the other, he's got his own instincts and campaign promises nudging him to be cautious and think about America's broader interests. The core of the debate is about numbers. The military is recommending an increase of 40,000 troops, an enormous addition that would bring the US presence in Afghanistan to levels not seen before. Leading the charge for this recommendation is General Stanley McChrystal, a well-respected military leader on the ground in Afghanistan. McChrystal believes that anything less would spell disaster. He paints a grim picture of what could happen if they don't act now: more chaos, stronger Taliban forces, and, worst of all, a situation where terrorists could use Afghanistan as a safe haven to plot against the US and its allies. Obama is feeling the weight of these arguments. He knows that McChrystal's recommendations are coming from someone with experience, someone who's seen the realities of Afghanistan up close. But he's also wary. To Obama, sending more troops feels like stepping into quicksand. Once you start, how do you stop? He knows that committing to a surge could mean years of ongoing conflict, with no guarantee of success. Obama is determined to avoid repeating the mistakes of the Iraq War, which dragged on far longer than anyone expected. Meanwhile, Vice President Joe Biden is bringing a fresh perspective to the table. Biden is skeptical of the whole idea of a troop surge. To him, Afghanistan isn't worth this level of commitment, especially since it's not directly threatening the United States. He argues for a counter-terrorism approach, suggesting that instead of large numbers of boots on the ground, the US should focus on smaller, targeted operations. Biden's plan involves using drones, special operations forces, and intelligence resources to go after specific terrorist leaders and dismantle al-Qaeda networks. He believes this strategy would save lives, reduce costs, and keep the US from getting bogged down in nation-building. The White House meetings are full of heated discussions. Obama listens to every voice, often weighing conflicting views. His Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, supports the military's recommendations, believing that the extra troops are essential to stabilize the region and buy time for the Afghan government to strengthen. Gates respects Biden's opinion, but feels that Afghanistan requires a more comprehensive solution. Obama is caught in the middle, struggling with the balance between his advisors' strong arguments. On one hand, the military leaders are almost demanding action, highlighting the risks of doing too little. They emphasize the urgency, warning that failure in Afghanistan could undermine US credibility and give terrorists a chance to grow. On the other, Biden's approach appeals to Obama's sense of caution and his desire to avoid an open-ended commitment. Biden reminds Obama that no matter what they do in Afghanistan, the ultimate goal should be to protect Americans, not necessarily to rebuild another country. As Obama listens to these perspectives, he is also thinking about the broader impact of these decisions. He's painfully aware of how the Iraq War became a quagmire, pulling resources and attention away from domestic priorities. For him, the idea of sinking resources and lives into another prolonged war is deeply troubling. But he also feels the pressure of protecting national security and showing strength to both allies and enemies. During one particularly intense meeting, Obama presses his military advisors for specifics. He wants to know exactly how the extra troops would change things. General McChrystal explains that with more soldiers, they could better protect Afghan civilians, which in turn could help build trust and push the Taliban out of key areas. McChrystal believes in counterinsurgency, a strategy that goes beyond fighting. It's about securing the population, winning their trust, and making sure they see the US presence as a force for stability, not occupation. Despite the thorough explanations, Obama isn't completely convinced. He keeps asking questions, pushing back, and looking for any assurance that a troop surge won't lead to an endless commitment. His advisors can see that Obama wants to make a decision, but he's not ready to fully endorse a plan that involves tens of thousands of additional troops. He wants a plan that's both strong enough to be effective and limited enough to keep America out of a prolonged occupation. As Chapter 2 closes, we're left with a sense of the immense pressure Obama is under. He's facing the expectations of his advisors, the hopes of the American people, and his own instincts about what's right. The military leaders are adamant that a surge is the only way to prevent Afghanistan from collapsing, while Biden and a few others argue that a smaller, targeted approach is the safer bet. Obama's decision will set the course not only for Afghanistan, but also for his legacy as a president dealing with wartime dilemmas. The chapter captures the tug-of-war in Obama's mind as he grapples with two contrasting strategies, one focused on robust, on-the-ground presence, and one on precise, limited strikes. His next move is uncertain, but what's clear is that whatever he decides, it will shape US involvement in Afghanistan for years to come. Chapter 3. The Afghan Strategy Review. In Chapter 3, the action shifts from pressing debates to a formalized review of the entire Afghan strategy. President Obama is at a crossroads, and he knows he can't move forward without fully understanding what success in Afghanistan would look like and what it would take to achieve it. To do this, he initiates a deep dive assessment involving some of the most critical voices in national security. Obama's goal is to answer two big questions. What is the US mission in Afghanistan, and what does victory look like? As Obama sets up this review, he gathers a team of top advisors and experts to weigh in. Vice President Biden, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton all have a seat at the table, along with high-ranking military officials and intelligence chiefs. It's a room full of powerhouse voices, each with unique insights and strong opinions. Obama wants everyone's input because he knows he can't afford to make this decision alone, especially with so much at stake. Each of these advisors has a slightly different perspective on Afghanistan. Biden, as always, is pushing for a smaller, more targeted counter-terrorism strategy, one that focuses on hunting down specific terrorist leaders rather than holding territory. He's vocal about his concerns that getting deeper into Afghanistan will only lead to a costly quagmire. Gates, on the other hand, sees Afghanistan as a place where America's broader security interests are at stake. He argues that a more robust military presence is essential to stabilize the region, defeat the Taliban, and prevent Afghanistan from becoming a breeding ground for terrorism once again. As the review continues, Hillary Clinton brings in her perspective from the State Department, emphasizing the importance of Afghan governance. She believes that simply fighting the Taliban isn't enough. The US also needs to support a stable Afghan government. She argues that without a strong Afghan administration to lead the people, any military efforts will be wasted because there will be no reliable structure to maintain order once US forces start withdrawing. Obama listens carefully, taking notes and occasionally pressing for more details. He's looking for a way to combine these perspectives into a cohesive strategy, but he quickly realizes that there's no easy way to reconcile all these viewpoints. The debate is too complex and the stakes are too high. Each person around the table is speaking from experience and genuine concern, and Obama finds himself torn between their recommendations. The review isn't just talk, it's backed by data, reports, and intelligence assessments. Advisors share findings from recent intelligence on Taliban movements, Afghan government stability, and the complex web of tribal politics that affects every decision in Afghanistan. They also look at the role of Pakistan, a critical yet often challenging partner in the region. Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban and its willingness to harbor certain militant groups is a wild card that Obama must consider. One of the most significant parts of this review is the question of nation building. Is the goal of the US to turn Afghanistan into a functioning democracy, or is it simply to prevent it from being a haven for terrorists? Obama is wary of the first option. He doesn't want to commit America to the long, expensive process of nation building if there's no clear path to success. But others argue that without a stable government in Afghanistan, there's little hope of long-term peace. A fragile Afghan government could quickly fall apart once US troops pull out, leading to chaos that could allow the Taliban and other extremists to rise again. The discussions also dive into the realities on the ground for Afghan civilians. For the US mission to succeed, the people of Afghanistan need to trust and support both their government and the US presence. Winning hearts and minds isn't just a phrase, it's an essential part of counterinsurgency strategy. The military leaders believe that with enough troops they can secure towns, protect civilians, and build goodwill. But Biden and others caution that no matter how many troops they send, there will always be limits to what the US can achieve. The idea of setting a timeline becomes another hot topic in the review. Obama is leaning toward establishing a time frame for US involvement, a signal to both Afghan leaders and the American public that the US commitment isn't open-ended, but the military is wary of timelines, fearing that they'll embolden the Taliban. They argue that if the Taliban knows the US plans to leave by a certain date, they'll just wait it out and resume operations as soon as the Americans are gone. The review stretches on for weeks, with each meeting as intense and thorough as the last. As Obama listens to these debates, he starts to see just how deep and layered the situation in Afghanistan really is. It's not simply about sending troops or pulling them out. It's about balancing security needs, political stability, and long-term goals in a country that has been a hotspot of conflict for decades. In the end, Obama's mind keeps circling back to the same challenge, finding a strategy that's strong enough to bring stability to Afghanistan without committing the US to an indefinite war. He's looking for a middle path, something that incorporates both Biden's limited approach and the military's call for a more extensive counterinsurgency plan. But the reality is that there may not be a perfect solution. Every option comes with risks, and every choice could lead to unforeseen consequences. As Chapter 3 closes, Obama is left with more questions than answers. The strategy review has given him insight into Afghanistan's complexities, but it hasn't offered a clear solution. His advisors are divided, the intelligence is nuanced, and the options are all fraught with potential downsides. Obama knows that soon he'll have to make a decision, but for now he's still weighing his options, aware that whatever path he chooses, it will have a profound impact on his presidency, America's role in the world, and the lives of countless people in Afghanistan. Chapter 4. Decision and Division. In Chapter 4, we reach a pivotal moment. President Obama is close to making a decision on how to handle Afghanistan, but the road to get there has been anything but smooth. The tension in the White House has reached new heights, with advisors and military leaders presenting their arguments as if they're in a courtroom. Obama feels the weight of this choice, knowing it will define his presidency and impact countless lives. But the closer he gets to a decision, the more divided his team becomes. The military is clear on its recommendation, a surge of 40,000 troops to strengthen the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. General Stanley McChrystal is at the heart of this push. He's been on the ground, seeing firsthand the challenges and the dangers, and he's confident that without these extra forces, the situation will spiral out of control. McChrystal believes that more troops are essential to carry out the counterinsurgency strategy effectively. To him, it's a matter of doing what's necessary to protect the Afghan people from the Taliban and secure the trust of local communities. But Obama is hesitant. He's cautious about making an open-ended commitment and doesn't want Afghanistan to become another never-ending war. He has promised the American people that he would focus on domestic issues and gradually bring an end to the wars. So he's thinking about ways to limit the U.S. involvement. One of his main ideas is setting a timeline, a deadline, to start pulling out troops so that the U.S. doesn't stay indefinitely. He's aware that setting a timeline might send mixed signals, but he feels it's essential to communicate that America's mission is limited and that Afghanistan needs to stand on its own eventually. Then there's Biden, who continues to be a vocal advocate for a counter-terrorism approach rather than a large-scale counterinsurgency. He argues that it's possible to neutralize terrorist threats without deploying tens of thousands of troops. For Biden, the answer is special operations, targeted strikes, and intelligence, not a massive ground presence. His approach would allow the U.S. to keep its footprint small, focus only on high-value targets, and avoid the extensive costs and risks associated with a troop surge. The divide in the room is sharp. Gates, Clinton, McChrystal, and other military officials believe a full counterinsurgency strategy is necessary to truly stabilize Afghanistan. They argue that if the U.S. does the job halfway, it could backfire, making the situation even worse. But Obama, listening to Biden, can't help but feel that a more restrained approach might be wiser, especially given America's already stretched resources. One of the biggest issues on Obama's mind is whether Afghanistan can sustain itself without long-term U.S. intervention. Even if a surge succeeds in pushing the Taliban out of certain areas, will the Afghan government be strong enough to hold those gains? He has seen reports on corruption within the Afghan administration, local warlords running their own fiefdoms, and officials who don't have the trust of the Afghan people. These challenges make him wonder if the U.S. is trying to fix a situation that may ultimately be unfixable. The debate over a timeline adds another layer of complexity. Military leaders are wary of setting an exit date, fearing it would allow the Taliban to wait out the Americans. They argue that counterinsurgency requires time, years, even decades, to take root and succeed. But Obama feels that without a timeline, the U.S. could end up in Afghanistan indefinitely, with no clear end in sight. He wants to send a message to the Afghan government too, urging them to take more responsibility and not just rely on the U.S. to solve their problems. Finally, after weeks of intense deliberation, Obama arrives at a decision that attempts to bridge these opposing views. He agrees to a compromise. He'll authorize a troop increase, but it won't be as high as the military requested. Instead of 40,000 troops, he approves around 30,000, and he sets a rough timeline for when the drawdown will begin. This way, he hopes to give the military enough resources to stabilize key areas while also signaling that the US commitment is not endless. When Obama announces his decision, it's met with mixed reactions. The military is pleased that they'll receive additional troops, but there's disappointment that the number is lower than expected and that there's now a time frame attached. Biden is somewhat relieved that the commitment won't be indefinite, but he still feels the strategy relies too heavily on a military approach when intelligence and counterterrorism could suffice. Obama's decision creates a kind of uneasy alliance between the different factions. No one is entirely satisfied, but they all recognize that the president has made his choice. For Obama, this compromise represents his vision of a middle path, strong enough to push back against the Taliban, but measured enough to keep the US from getting stuck in a perpetual war. As the chapter closes, we see that Obama's decision has brought some resolution, but it has also revealed the deep divisions within his team and within the broader US approach to Afghanistan. His strategy is a balancing act, and everyone knows it. The military will have to make the most of the resources they've been given, while Obama watches carefully to see if his plan will pay off, or if it will lead to even tougher choices down the road. Chapter 4 leaves us with a sense of both determination and caution. Obama has made a decision that feels right to him, but the outcome is uncertain, and the challenges ahead are enormous. He's chosen a path forward, but as we'll see, the consequences of this choice will continue to unfold, bringing new tests of his leadership, resilience, and ability to navigate a complex world. Chapter 5. Implementing the Surge. Chapter 5 dives into the next phase of the plan, putting Obama's decision into action. With the surge underway, an additional 30,000 US troops begin to make their way to Afghanistan. The challenge is clear: this troop increase must be effective, but it also has to be swift because there's a timeline for withdrawal. This chapter paints a vivid picture of what it takes to launch a surge, the expectations riding on it, and the many obstacles that the soldiers and commanders will face as they execute this high-stakes mission. General Stanley McChrystal, the man at the helm in Afghanistan, is under immense pressure. He knows that these additional forces are his chance to show that a counterinsurgency strategy can work here, but the clock is ticking. Obama's compromise on troop numbers and the set timeline means that McChrystal must act quickly and efficiently. The surge needs to be more than just an influx of soldiers. It's about changing the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, building trust, and rooting out insurgents, all while dealing with a very complex and often hostile environment. The first task is for US forces to secure key regions, particularly those where the Taliban is strongest. This means stepping into areas that have been left vulnerable for too long. For the soldiers on the ground, these missions are dangerous and demanding. They're not just tasked with fighting, they also have to interact with locals, gain their support, and prove that the US presence is meant to help them, not harm them. It's a fine line to walk, as each interaction with Afghan civilians could be a step toward winning trust or a setback that fuels resentment. Securing towns and villages in Taliban-dominated areas is more complex than traditional warfare. In a counterinsurgency, success isn't measured by battles won but by how safe and stable a community becomes. US forces must deal with local leaders, address the community's needs, and ensure that the people feel safe enough to support the Afghan government. This approach demands patience and adaptability, as every town and village has its own dynamics influenced by years of conflict, tribal loyalties, and distrust of outsiders. One of the hardest challenges for US soldiers is distinguishing friend from foe. In Afghanistan, Taliban fighters don't always wear uniforms or gather in easily identifiable groups. They blend in with the local population, which makes it incredibly difficult for troops to know who they can trust. This creates a constant feeling of tension and vulnerability, as any civilian could potentially be a Taliban supporter or an informant. The stress of this environment weighs heavily on the troops, who must be cautious and respectful in every interaction. The surge also brings an increase in airstrikes and nighttime raids, which are meant to disrupt Taliban operations and prevent attacks. These tactics can be effective in weakening the Taliban's hold on certain areas, but they come with serious risks. Civilian casualties are an unfortunate and unavoidable part of these operations, and when they happen, they can turn entire communities against the US and its allies. Every mistake has a ripple effect. But Crystal is aware of this and is constantly working to minimize these incidents, knowing that every civilian life lost undermines the larger mission of gaining Afghan support. As more troops flood into Afghanistan, the US also ramps up its efforts to train Afghan security forces. The hope is that eventually the Afghan army and police will be able to take over security responsibilities. However, training Afghan forces is no simple task. Many Afghan recruits come from rural backgrounds and have limited education and military experience. Additionally, there's a shortage of trustworthy leaders within the Afghan security forces. Corruption and loyalty issues make it hard to know who will stick by the US and Afghan governments when things get tough. Another crucial part of the surge is building infrastructure. The US is pouring resources into roads, schools, clinics, and other community needs. The theory is that a more developed Afghanistan will be a more stable Afghanistan. By creating access to education, healthcare, and transportation, US leaders hope to foster loyalty to the Afghan government. But even this well-intentioned goal is complex. Taliban forces often target these infrastructure projects, either by sabotaging them directly or intimidating local workers. It's a frustrating cycle. US forces build, the Taliban destroys, and local communities are caught in the middle. As Chapter 5 progresses, we see McChrystal and his team grappling with the enormity of the task. They're well aware that this surge has to succeed quickly. The timeline set by Obama means that they don't have the luxury of waiting to see if things improve gradually. The pressure is intense and each day brings new challenges. McChrystal spends long hours with his commanders, analyzing strategies, reviewing operations, and making adjustments. He knows that the success or failure of the surge will ultimately reflect on him and could shape the future of US involvement in Afghanistan. The human cost of the surge becomes evident, with soldiers facing daily risks and Afghan civilians caught in the crossfire. For those on the front lines, the surge is a matter of survival as much as strategy. The soldiers are living this mission every day, dealing with the harsh realities of combat, separation from their families, and the emotional strain of working in such a dangerous environment. The sacrifices are real, and they highlight the profound commitment involved in trying to achieve stability in a place as complex as Afghanistan. Chapter 5 concludes with a sense of urgency and tension. The surge is underway, but there's no guarantee that it will achieve its goals. McChrystal and his team are doing everything they can to make it work, but Afghanistan remains as unpredictable as ever. Obama's timeline looms large, and everyone involved knows that the clock is ticking. The stakes are higher than ever, as every day and every decision bring them closer to the point where the surge will either be declared a success or a failure. Chapter 6. The Role of Pakistan. Chapter 6 shifts the focus from Afghanistan to its crucial yet complicated neighbor, Pakistan. To truly understand the war in Afghanistan, Obama and his team know they must also understand Pakistan's role in the conflict. Pakistan is both an ally in the fight against terrorism and a thorn in the side of US efforts to stabilize the region. It's a relationship marked by shared interests, hidden agendas, and deep mistrust. And Obama is keenly aware that without Pakistan's cooperation, victory in Afghanistan may be impossible. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed nation with a powerful military and intelligence service, is more than just a neighboring country. It's a key player in the region. Historically, Pakistan has had a significant influence on Afghanistan's politics and security, often using its ties with Afghan leaders and militant groups to maintain leverage. The Pakistani Military and Intelligence Agency, known as the ISI, have long-standing connections with certain factions of the Taliban. This complicates the situation because, while Pakistan officially supports the US, some elements within the Pakistani establishment see the Taliban as a strategic asset rather than an enemy. The heart of the issue is Pakistan's dual approach. On one hand, Pakistan works with the US to combat terrorism, allowing American forces to use its territory for supply routes and occasionally targeting extremists. On the other hand, Pakistan's government and military have their own concerns, particularly about India, their historic rival. Pakistan views a strong Taliban presence as a counterbalance to India's influence in Afghanistan. This means that while Pakistan may support the US on the surface, it also keeps back channels open with certain militant groups, hoping to use them as leverage in regional politics. For Obama, this dual role presents a massive challenge. He needs Pakistan's cooperation to defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, yet he's constantly reminded that Pakistan might not fully be on the same team. His advisors debate how to approach Pakistan. Some, like Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, believe in diplomatic engagement and building trust. Others, including military officials, are more skeptical, seeing Pakistan as an unreliable partner that needs to be pressured rather than courted. Obama's strategy for Pakistan includes a combination of incentives and warnings. He knows that Pakistan relies heavily on US aid, not just militarily, but also economically. By offering financial and military support, Obama hopes to keep Pakistan on board. However, he also doesn't shy away from making it clear that if Pakistan doesn't take stronger action against Taliban factions operating within its borders, the US may reconsider its aid commitments. It's a delicate balancing act, and Obama realizes that pushing too hard could backfire, potentially driving Pakistan further away. Throughout this chapter, Woodward paints a picture of the frustrating and often secretive interactions between US and Pakistani officials. Behind closed doors, the conversations are tense. Pakistani leaders insist they are doing everything they can, but the US intelligence community sees evidence that certain militant groups are thriving in Pakistani territory. For example, the Haqqani network, one of the most dangerous Taliban-affiliated groups, is believed to operate with relative freedom from Pakistan's tribal areas. This network carries out attacks in Afghanistan and then retreats across the border, where it's hard for US forces to reach them. To address this, the US relies heavily on drone strikes in Pakistan, targeting high-level militants in remote areas. These strikes are effective in taking out key figures, but they are also controversial. Drone strikes often lead to civilian casualties, which anger the Pakistani public and strain diplomatic relations. Every time a drone strike kills civilians, it fuels anti-American sentiment, and the Pakistani government publicly condemns the strikes, even though they secretly allow them to continue. This cycle creates a complicated dynamic where Pakistan's leaders must balance their cooperation with the US against the demands of their own people, who often see the US as an aggressor. Obama's frustration grows as he realizes that Pakistan's priorities may never fully align with America's goals in Afghanistan. He feels trapped in a situation where the US is dependent on a partner that can't be fully trusted. Despite his best efforts to work with Pakistan, there are constant setbacks. Intelligence reports reveal that Taliban fighters regularly cross into Afghanistan after regrouping in Pakistan, undermining the gains made by US and Afghan forces. Obama knows that as long as Pakistan provides a safe haven, it will be nearly impossible to achieve lasting peace in Afghanistan. Adding to the complexity is Pakistan's own internal situation. The country faces its own insurgencies, political instability, and economic struggles. Pakistani leaders argue that they have their hands full with domestic issues and that they can't take on the Taliban in the same way the US expects them to. Obama understands these challenges but feels that Pakistan could still be doing more to help. His patience wears thin, and he starts to question if US aid is being used effectively or if it's merely enabling Pakistan's double game. As the chapter concludes, Obama realizes that Pakistan's role in the Afghan war is one of the most complicated aspects of his strategy. He can't succeed without their help, yet he can't fully rely on them either. Pakistan remains a wild card, a partner whose loyalty is uncertain. Obama's team continues to debate how to handle the relationship, but there's no easy answer. They can either continue trying to build trust, hoping Pakistan will eventually come around, or they can take a harder line, risking the relationship but potentially sending a stronger message. Chapter 6 leaves readers with a sense of the frustration and uncertainty that defines the US-Pakistan relationship. Obama's plan for Afghanistan now rests on a partnership that feels shaky at best. The stage is set for more challenges as the complexities of regional politics threaten to derail America's goals. Pakistan's influence casts a long shadow over every decision, and Obama is left searching for a way to work with a partner he can't entirely trust. The stakes are high, and the clock is ticking, with Pakistan holding a crucial, if unpredictable, key to the outcome. Chapter 7: Counter-Terrorism and Drone Strikes. Chapter 7 takes a closer look at one of the most controversial and critical aspects of Obama's war strategy: the use of drone strikes as a counter-terrorism tool. These drones, unmanned aerial vehicles equipped with cameras and weapons, have become a signature part of Obama's approach to targeting terrorists. For Obama, the drones offer a way to strike at the heart of extremist networks without putting American troops in harm's way. But with every strike comes questions about effectiveness, ethics, and the potential for civilian casualties. Drone strikes appeal to Obama's vision of a clean war. Instead of deploying thousands of soldiers on the ground, drones can fly into dangerous territories, targeting high-value individuals with precision. It's a technology-driven approach to warfare, one that promises to cut down on risks to American lives and focus directly on key terrorist leaders. Obama sees drones as a way to balance security needs with his commitment to reducing America's long-term military presence in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. But this approach isn't without its challenges. For one, there's the issue of intelligence. Targeting someone with a drone requires precise information about where that person is, what they're doing, and whether there are any civilians around. The US relies heavily on local informants, signals intelligence, and surveillance data to make these calls, but intelligence is rarely perfect. One missed detail, and a drone strike could accidentally hit a wedding, a family gathering, or a group of children playing nearby. These incidents do happen, and when they do, the fallout is immediate and intense. Civilian casualties caused by drone strikes stir up anger, not only among local populations, but also within the Pakistani government and other international allies. Pakistani officials publicly denounced the strikes, even though they privately cooperate with the US on certain operations. This delicate dance creates a tense atmosphere where US officials feel they're walking on eggshells. Every drone strike that goes wrong could turn the public against them and fuel anti-American sentiment. The chapter also dives into the mechanics of how drone strikes are decided. Each strike involves layers of review and analysis, with Obama often personally involved in approving certain high-profile targets. He spends hours in the Situation Room with his advisors, combing through intelligence reports and weighing the pros and cons of each potential strike. It's a hands-on approach, one that speaks to Obama's desire to maintain control over this powerful and often controversial tool. He doesn't take these decisions lightly, understanding that each strike not only eliminates a threat, but also has far-reaching consequences. One of the main targets of the drone campaign is Al-Qaeda, specifically their leaders and operatives who are believed to be hiding in Pakistan's tribal regions. By targeting these leaders, Obama hopes to weaken the network's ability to plan and execute attacks on the US and its allies. The idea is that with every drone strike that takes out a top terrorist, Al-Qaeda's capabilities are diminished. But Obama's advisors warn that this approach may have its limits. Killing individual leaders might disrupt operations in the short term, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate the threat. New leaders often step up, sometimes even more radical and committed than those who came before. Then there's the issue of signature strikes. These are drone strikes, not targeting specific known individuals, but rather groups of people whose behaviors fit a certain pattern associated with terrorist activity. Signature strikes are even more controversial because they increase the risk of targeting the wrong people. Critics argue that these strikes are too reliant on assumptions and that innocent people are more likely to be caught in the crossfire. Obama is aware of these criticisms and pushes his team to be cautious, but he also believes that signature strikes are a necessary tool in a war where enemies often hide in plain sight. As drone strikes continue, the ethical debate intensifies. Human rights groups, journalists, and international organizations raise serious concerns about the legality and morality of these attacks. They argue that drones create a dehumanized approach to warfare, where operators thousands of miles away are making life and death decisions with the click of a button. They worry that this detachment from the battlefield makes it easier to disregard the potential for civilian harm. Obama listens to these criticisms, and while he respects the arguments, he believes that drones are an unfortunate but necessary part of modern warfare. The debate over drone strikes reflects a larger dilemma that Obama faces: how to protect America without compromising the very values he seeks to uphold. He doesn't want the US to be seen as a force that strikes indiscriminately, yet he feels a responsibility to do everything in his power to prevent another 9/11-style attack. Drones, with all their pros and cons, seem to offer a middle ground, a way to strike at enemies without becoming mired in more ground wars. But even Obama knows that this strategy comes with moral and strategic risks that could haunt him down the line. As the chapter closes, we're left with the complexity of Obama's counterterrorism strategy. Drones are not a perfect solution, but they're the best option available in a challenging, dangerous world. Obama is doing his best to balance security with ethics, knowing that every strike is a gamble with high stakes. For those who work alongside him, this chapter reveals the immense responsibility and emotional toll that comes with deciding who lives and who dies based on intelligence reports and drone footage. The line between right and wrong is often blurry, and Obama knows that these decisions will be judged not only in the present, but also by future generations looking back on this era of warfare. Chapter 7 shows us that the war on terror is not just fought on battlefields, it's also fought in the minds and hearts of those who have to make impossible choices. Drone strikes offer both a solution and a question, a way forward, but also a path filled with uncertainty. As Obama grapples with the ethical dilemmas of his counterterrorism strategy, we see the burden of leadership in its rawest form, a constant, pressing need to protect his country while striving to uphold the values that define it. Chapter 8: The Limits of Counterinsurgency. In Chapter 8, Woodward takes us deep into the realities and frustrations of Obama's counterinsurgency strategy. The troop surge is in full swing, and US forces are spread across Afghanistan, working hard to stabilize the region. But the results are mixed, and cracks in the counterinsurgency plan begin to show. Obama's hopes that the surge would swiftly turn things around are beginning to clash with the messy, unpredictable nature of this conflict. The chapter highlights the limits of counterinsurgency, a strategy that requires not just military strength, but also immense patience, resources, and the cooperation of local populations. Counterinsurgency, or COIN, is designed to be more than just a combat strategy. It's about building relationships with local communities, securing their trust, and showing them that the US presence is intended to bring peace and stability. It's a strategy that focuses on winning hearts and minds. US forces aren't just soldiers, they're diplomats, builders, and peacekeepers. They're expected to fight the Taliban while simultaneously helping Afghan communities rebuild their lives. But as idealistic as this sounds, COIN is incredibly challenging to execute in a place as complex as Afghanistan. For one thing, Afghanistan is a country with a long history of resisting foreign influence. The US is not the first outside power to try and stabilize it. The British and the Soviets both tried and failed. Many Afghans are skeptical of American intentions, and the Taliban capitalizes on this distrust, painting the US as an occupying force. To overcome these suspicions, American soldiers are tasked with forming personal connections with Afghan villagers, learning their customs and understanding their needs. But this is easier said than done, and there's a constant fear that any goodwill they build could vanish overnight with a single misstep or a civilian casualty. The strain on US troops is palpable. Soldiers are asked to patrol dangerous areas, engage with locals, and carry out projects like building schools or clinics, all while staying vigilant for Taliban attacks. The physical and emotional toll is enormous. Woodward describes the exhaustion among the ranks, with troops juggling the dual roles of warriors and peacemakers. Many feel they're being asked to do the impossible, fight an enemy that blends into the population while also trying to befriend that same population. Every day brings new challenges, and the soldiers wonder if their efforts are really making a difference. Complicating things further is the persistent issue of corruption within the Afghan government. Obama's COIN strategy depends heavily on having a strong and honest Afghan government to partner with. The idea is that US forces will stabilize areas and then gradually hand control over to local Afghan officials. But what happens when those officials are corrupt, ineffective, or even in league with the Taliban? Woodward explains how pervasive corruption is in Afghanistan, with government officials often more interested in lining their pockets than helping their people. This corruption makes it hard for Afghans to trust their leaders, and by extension, to trust the US forces who are working with them. Obama and his advisors are well aware of these issues. They know that COIN is a fragile strategy, one that depends on factors beyond their control. They can pour in resources, send more troops, and build infrastructure. But if the Afghan government doesn't do its part, all those efforts could be wasted. The military leaders are frustrated too. Generals like McChrystal and Petraeus believe in the principles of COIN, but recognize that the strategy might be reaching its limits. They worry that they're spending resources and risking lives in a strategy that might ultimately fail if Afghan officials don't step up. Then there's the question of time. COIN isn't a quick fix. It's a long-term strategy that can take years, even decades, to show results. Obama is already feeling pressure from the American public and Congress to bring the troops home, and he's committed to his timeline for withdrawal. This timeline, however, puts added pressure on the counter-insurgency efforts. The military feels they're being asked to work miracles within a limited time frame, and they worry that a premature withdrawal could undo any progress made. The Taliban, on the other hand, senses an opportunity. They know that the US has a deadline, and they exploit this by playing the waiting game. They keep a low profile, avoiding large-scale confrontations with US forces, and focus on winning over local populations, especially in rural areas. The Taliban offers protection and financial support to communities, creating a shadow government that rivals the official Afghan government. In many areas, the Taliban's influence grows, and they wait patiently, believing that once US forces leave, they can regain control. As the chapter unfolds, we see Obama's growing frustration. He wanted coin to be a path to stability and peace, but he now realizes that it might be a band-aid solution in a conflict that runs far deeper. He wrestles with the idea that the US might be pouring resources into an unwinnable situation, one where the gains are temporary and the setbacks are inevitable. Obama is forced to consider whether it's worth continuing a strategy with so many inherent challenges. Chapter 8 ends with a sobering realization: the limits of counterinsurgency are becoming painfully clear. While coin has had some successes, it hasn't produced the sweeping changes that Obama and his advisors hoped for. Afghanistan remains a deeply divided country, and the Taliban's influence lingers in the shadows. Obama faces a tough choice: stick with coin in the hopes that it will eventually pay off, or start considering alternative strategies that might be less ambitious but more realistic. This chapter highlights the dilemma of a strategy built on hope and hard work, but undermined by local politics, cultural complexities, and time constraints. For Obama, it's a lesson in the harsh realities of war. No matter how well conceived a plan might be, there are always limits. And as the deadline for withdrawal inches closer, he realizes that those limits may soon force him to make some very difficult decisions about America's role in Afghanistan. Chapter 9: Troop Withdrawal and Timelines. In Chapter 9, the story shifts as Obama's focus turns to a critical question: how and when can US troops begin to withdraw from Afghanistan? The surge has been ongoing, and while there have been some successes, it's clear that this mission won't last forever. Obama has committed to a timeline, aiming to start pulling troops out soon, and that deadline is rapidly approaching. For the president, this isn't just about logistics. It's about fulfilling a promise to the American people to bring their sons and daughters home. But it's also a high-stakes decision that could impact the fragile progress made so far. As Obama grapples with the idea of withdrawal, he's confronted with conflicting advice from his advisors and military leaders. Many in the military, especially those who have spent years working on the ground in Afghanistan, are cautious about leaving too soon. Generals like David Petraeus and Stanley McChrystal worry that a hasty exit could undo all the gains made by the US and Afghan forces. They see the Afghan government and military as still too weak to hold the country on their own, especially in regions where Taliban influence remains strong. But Obama is firm on his commitment. He knows that the American public is weary of the war. Years of fighting, rising costs, and the constant reports of US casualties have left many questioning why they're still involved in a conflict halfway across the world. Obama has always viewed his role as one of finding a balanced solution, and he believes that a responsible, phased withdrawal could satisfy both his promise to bring troops home and the need to leave Afghanistan stable. This creates a tension between the president and the military. On one hand, Obama respects the military's expertise and understands their concerns about security. On the other hand, he feels it's his duty to set the broader direction and decide when it's time to start stepping back. He believes that having an end date for the US presence is essential, not just for American morale, but also to motivate Afghan leaders to take charge. If Afghan officials know that the US won't always be there to back them up, they might be more inclined to build a stable government and invest in their own security forces. One of the major issues Obama encounters is figuring out how to balance this phased withdrawal with the demands of counterinsurgency. COIN, as we've seen, is a long-term strategy that requires a steady presence and ongoing support to work effectively. The idea of setting a timeline doesn't sit well with many military leaders who argue that the Taliban will simply wait until the US leaves and then reassert their control. They believe that a conditions-based approach, where withdrawal is tied to progress on the ground, would be more effective. But Obama insists that a timeline is necessary, both politically and strategically. In these discussions, Vice President Joe Biden emerges as a strong advocate for withdrawal. Biden has long been skeptical of the extensive commitment in Afghanistan, and he sees the timeline as an important step in focusing on the counter-terrorism strategy he's been pushing for. Biden believes that the US should prioritize targeting al-Qaeda and terrorist networks directly, rather than staying bogged down in nation-building and counterinsurgency. For Biden, a more nimble approach focused on drones, intelligence, and special operations is the way forward, and he argues that a timeline will help steer the US toward this leaner, more targeted strategy. As the deadline for the first phase of withdrawal approaches, Obama begins to announce specific plans. His aim is to withdraw a certain number of troops within the next year, gradually scaling down the US presence in Afghanistan. He knows this move will be met with mixed reactions, both in Washington and in Afghanistan. For US troops and commanders on the ground, there's a sense of unfinished business. Many feel that they've worked hard to secure towns, build relationships, and stabilize regions, and they worry that their efforts could be in vain if the withdrawal is too swift. Meanwhile, Afghan leaders react with a mix of apprehension and resolve. President Hamid Karzai, the head of the Afghan government, has been critical of certain US actions, but also knows that the presence of American troops has been a crucial support for his administration. The Afghan government is far from stable, with issues like corruption and factionalism undermining its authority. Obama's announcement signals to Karzai and his officials that the time is coming for them to step up and take greater responsibility, but it's unclear if they're truly ready for the challenge. As the chapter unfolds, we see Obama wrestling with the emotional and strategic weight of his decision. He knows that starting the withdrawal is a defining moment in his presidency, a move that will be remembered and analyzed for years to come. He wants to make sure that this isn't just about meeting a deadline, it's about leaving Afghanistan in a position to stand on its own. Yet, he's aware that there are no guarantees. Afghanistan remains a highly unstable region, and the Taliban's resilience is a constant reminder that the fight is far from over. The chapter concludes with Obama setting his course. He's determined to stick to his timeline, but remains open to adjusting the pace of withdrawal if necessary. His decision reflects his desire to end the war responsibly, balancing the need to support Afghanistan with the reality that US resources are limited and that Americans want to see an end to their involvement in this war. He knows that not everyone will agree with his approach, but he believes it's the best way forward. Chapter 9 leaves us with a sense of both optimism and uncertainty. Obama's commitment to withdrawal represents a turning point, a signal that the US is looking toward the end of its mission in Afghanistan. But the risks are real, and the future is unknown. As the withdrawal process begins, the US and Afghanistan enter a new phase, one that will test the resilience of both nations and the effectiveness of everything they've worked for. Obama has made his choice, but only time will tell if it was the right one. Chapter 10: Legacy and Reflections. Chapter 10 brings the story full circle as Obama and his team begin to grapple with the legacy of the US mission in Afghanistan. The withdrawal process has begun, the surge is winding down, and the administration is looking at the impact of nearly a decade of American presence in the country. The questions on everyone's mind are clear. Did they accomplish enough to justify the sacrifices? Will Afghanistan be able to stand on its own, or will the hard-fought gains unravel after the US leaves? Obama reflects deeply on the choices he's made and the path ahead, knowing that his legacy is now tied to the fate of a distant nation. This chapter opens with Obama taking stock of the war's toll. He has met with countless soldiers, listened to the stories of their experiences, and seen the sacrifices that families across America have made. These personal connections weigh on him as he reflects on his decisions. As a leader, Obama has always felt the responsibility to protect American lives, but he's also tried to honor the sacrifices of those who served. Every fallen soldier, every wounded veteran, and every civilian casualty in Afghanistan reminds him of the stakes of the choices he's made. The administration's focus is shifting towards transitioning control to Afghan forces. Obama's hope is that after years of training and partnership, the Afghan military and police are ready to take on the responsibility of securing their own country. But reports from the ground suggest that this transition may not be as smooth as they'd hoped. There are challenges within the Afghan forces, including issues of training, discipline, and morale. Corruption continues to plague the Afghan government, and many local officials are more loyal to tribal leaders or warlords than to a unified Afghan state. Obama's advisors offer varying perspectives on the future. Vice President Joe Biden, who had always favored a lighter, more targeted approach, feels somewhat vindicated. He believes the US should maintain a limited presence, focusing on counter-terrorism efforts rather than a broad counterinsurgency. Biden argues that by keeping a small footprint, the US can prevent Afghanistan from becoming a terrorist haven without getting bogged down in its internal issues. On the other hand, some military officials are concerned that a smaller force won't be enough to maintain stability. They fear that without continued US support, the Afghan government could falter, creating an opening for the Taliban to regain control. General Petraeus and others express their worry that the gains made through years of sacrifice could quickly vanish if the US pulls out too soon. These concerns weigh heavily on Obama, who understands the risks but also feels the need to respect the timeline he's set. The chapter dives into the complexities of Afghanistan's political landscape. Woodward paints a picture of a country struggling with deep-seated issues that go beyond the reach of any foreign intervention. Afghanistan is not a monolithic state, it's a patchwork of ethnicities, tribes, and loyalties, each with its own interests and agendas. For many Afghans, loyalty to family, tribe, or region outweighs loyalty to a central government. This fragmented structure makes it hard for the Afghan government to function effectively, and it's one of the reasons why corruption has been so difficult to combat. Obama reflects on these challenges with a mixture of hope and realism. He knows that the US can't impose a unified government on Afghanistan. The people themselves must decide the future of their country, but he also hopes that the efforts to build institutions, train soldiers, and improve infrastructure will leave a positive legacy. Obama wants to believe that America's time in Afghanistan has helped set the stage for a more stable, self-reliant nation, even if the path ahead is uncertain. As Obama contemplates the legacy of his decisions, he's aware that history will judge him, not just by the actions he took, but by the results they produce. His presidency has been defined by difficult choices, and he hopes that future generations will understand the complexities he faced. For Obama, Afghanistan was never about a clear-cut victory. It was about doing what he believed was right in an incredibly complicated situation. He knows that some will criticize his approach, while others will support his vision of a limited, responsible withdrawal. The chapter closes with a reflection on the broader impact of the Afghan war on American foreign policy. Woodward suggests that the lessons of Afghanistan will shape how the US approaches future conflicts. The experience has shown the limits of military power in achieving political change and the dangers of prolonged foreign interventions. For Obama, the Afghan war has been a sobering reminder that while America has tremendous strength, there are limits to what it can achieve abroad. He hopes that future leaders will remember these lessons as they navigate the complex global landscape. As Chapter 10 ends, we see a president who is both hopeful and humbled. Obama has done his best to fulfill his duty as commander-in-chief, balancing the demands of security with the moral responsibility of leadership. He knows that Afghanistan's future is now largely out of his hands, and he can only hope that the groundwork laid by the US will allow the Afghan people to build a stable and prosperous country. The chapter leaves readers with a sense of the immense responsibility that comes with leadership and the difficult choices that define a president's legacy. Chapter 10 provides a fitting conclusion to Woodward's account, encapsulating the complexities, achievements, and unresolved questions that define America's involvement in Afghanistan. Obama's journey through the Afghan conflict is a story of ambition, struggle, and ultimately, the acceptance of limits. His legacy, like the future of Afghanistan, remains unwritten, a testament to the unpredictable and often unfinished nature of history. Epilogue: Reflections on Power and War. In the epilogue, Woodward reflects on the complex tapestry of decisions, personalities, and principles that have shaped America's engagement in Afghanistan. It's a moment to step back and examine the broader themes that define not only Obama's presidency, but also the American approach to war, diplomacy, and the limits of power. The Afghan conflict, once seen as a straightforward fight against terrorism, has transformed into a lesson on the intricacies and unexpected consequences of intervention. Woodward emphasizes that Afghanistan in many ways symbolizes the challenges of modern warfare. The conflict began with clear goals: dismantle al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban, and create a stable government. But as years passed, these goals became clouded by the realities of Afghanistan's tribal politics, corruption, and the Taliban's resilience. What began as a counter-terrorism mission evolved into a counter-insurgency operation, and then into an exercise in nation-building. Each shift added layers of complexity, and the initial mission morphed into something far larger and more complicated. One of the epilogue's key themes is the tension between military power and political reality. Obama's journey throughout the book is marked by this struggle. He came into office with a commitment to reduce America's foreign entanglements, yet he found himself increasing troop levels and grappling with a war that seemed resistant to quick solutions. Woodward captures Obama's frustration with the limitations of military power, showing how even the most sophisticated strategies can falter when confronted with ground realities that are often unpredictable. Woodward also reflects on the personalities that have driven the conflict. Figures like General Stanley McChrystal, General David Petraeus, and Vice President Joe Biden each brought their own perspectives and priorities to the table. McChrystal and Petraeus, both deeply committed to counterinsurgency, believed that Afghanistan could be stabilized through the right mix of force, diplomacy, and development. Biden, on the other hand, was more skeptical of nation-building and advocated for a leaner, counter-terrorism-focused approach. Their debates and disagreements illustrate the difficulty of forming a cohesive strategy in a situation with no clear answers. In this final analysis, Woodward also revisits the relationship between the US and Pakistan, a theme that has threaded throughout the book. Pakistan, with its unique position as both an ally and a complicating factor, has influenced nearly every aspect of the Afghan war. The ISI's complex relationship with the Taliban, Pakistan's internal struggles, and its rivalry with India have made it an unpredictable partner. For Obama and his advisors, Pakistan was a constant reminder of the difficulties in relying on a partner with its own conflicting priorities. This uneasy alliance, Woodward suggests, epitomizes the complicated nature of international relationships in modern warfare. Woodward highlights that while Obama has sought to address these challenges thoughtfully, he has also faced significant criticism. Some have argued that he was too cautious, that his reliance on timelines and desire to limit the US commitment undermined the mission's effectiveness. Others contend that he was too focused on nation-building, diverting resources that could have been directed solely at eliminating terrorist threats. This critique underscores the broader challenge faced by any leader, the struggle to strike the right balance between military strength and political pragmatism, between short-term gains and long-term stability. The epilogue doesn't shy away from the human cost of the conflict. Woodward notes the sacrifices made by American soldiers, Afghan civilians, and countless others who were affected by the war. The cost in lives, resources, and psychological toll has been immense. These sacrifices remind readers that every decision in the Situation Room has a profound impact on individuals on the ground. The war in Afghanistan was never just a strategic exercise, it was a series of human experiences, each marked by bravery, resilience, and often tragedy. In a broader sense, Woodward's reflections raise questions about the future of US foreign policy. The Afghan war has shown the limits of even the most powerful military in achieving political stability in foreign lands. It's a lesson that resonates beyond Afghanistan, speaking to the challenges America will face in future conflicts. How does the US balance its responsibility to combat terrorism with the need to respect the sovereignty of other nations? How does it pursue stability without getting entangled in endless wars? For Obama, the Afghan war became a journey of learning and, in some ways, humility. He entered the White House determined to make smart, informed decisions about America's role in the world, but Afghanistan proved that even the most well-intentioned leaders face obstacles that can't always be overcome by strategy alone. Woodward suggests that this experience will shape Obama's approach to future conflicts, instilling a deep understanding of the costs and complexities of war. As the epilogue draws to a close, Woodward leaves readers with a sense of the unfinished business that remains in Afghanistan. The US may be drawing down its troops, but the conflict is far from resolved. Afghanistan's future is uncertain, and the Taliban's influence persists. For Obama, the question is not whether he did enough, but whether what he did will leave a lasting impact. He hopes that the Afghan government and people will carry forward the efforts of the past decade, building a future that is stable and secure. Woodward's epilogue encapsulates the journey of a president, a military, and a nation navigating the complexities of war in the 21st century. It's a story of ambition tempered by reality, of ideals challenged by ground truths. The Afghan war, with all its triumphs and tragedies, has taught America lessons that will echo through history. The legacy of this conflict is not yet clear, but one thing is certain. It has left an indelible mark on those who were part of it and on those who will remember it. In the end, Woodward's War isn't just a story about Afghanistan. It's a reflection on the nature of power, the responsibilities of leadership, and the often painful choices that define a nation's path. For Obama, the war has been both a burden and a duty, a chapter in his presidency that will be analyzed and debated for years to come. And for readers, Woodward's account serves as a reminder that every conflict, no matter how distant, is ultimately about people. The leaders who make decisions, the soldiers who carry them out, and the civilians whose lives are forever changed.